Hi all, this is KB and this is combination knitting. This is sort of a anatomy physiology course on knitting. Just a little recap here. The features of combined knitting are our knit stitch, where we wrap counterclockwise in a conventional knitting industry standard direction. But when we purl wrapping in a clockwise direction. Clockwise. We went over that in the first video. And there are some ramifications to doing that, although it is an easy way to purl. Let's take a look at stitch mount and how we wrap. Now, on first glance, it appears that our stitches just lay over the top of our needle. But if we really stretch them out and look at them, we realize that they are actually diagonally crossing over our needle. But if we look at a stitch, we see that it is actually flat. So when we knit, wrap counterclockwise, and we produce a stitch that looks like this. We call this the leading leg because we knit from right to left. And this is the right leg, so this is the leading leg. Left leg is the lagging leg. So right now we see that that leading leg is in front. However, we purl in a clockwise direction. We produce a stitch. I don't know if you can see it very well. Let me transfer it to this needle so we can see it. So the right stitch leg now, or the leading stitch leg, is in back. So we produce two different stitch mounts. Let me explain that further. Let's take a little closer look at a stitch and go over some terminology. So here's the stitch. I'm kind of elongating it so we can really take a good look at it. Here's the running yarn. Whoops. Here's the running yarn on each side right here. I call that the running yarn. It's the little arms that link each stitch together. And then we see that these are all nice stitches. None of them are twisted. That means that the legs are open and relaxed at the bottom. A twisted stitch would look like this. And right in here, the legs are crossed. We don't want that. I'll show you a piece of twisted stitch knitting. There are times when it's a decorative need, but usually it's just a poor choice. So here we have the stitch legs. This is the right stitch leg and the left stitch leg. That's what I tend to call them. Some people do call this one the leading leg because we knit from right to left. This is the leading leg and this is the lagging leg. You can use either term you want. Now, if you've ever dropped your stitches and you try to put them on your stitch, you realize that without twisting the legs of the stitch, it can go on the needle this way, which is the industry standard stitch mount. But perhaps maybe we put it on our needle this way. Still, the legs are open and this is a turn stitch mount. we're going to be using both of these stitch mounts when we do combination knitting, because the stitch mount is determined by the direction your stitch is wrapped. So let's take a look at this stitch. This is the right leg and a turned stitch mount. But if we try to knit into it like this, what are we doing? We're twisting the stitch legs, and we're going to get a twisted stitch out of it. So we are always going to knit into the face or into the right leg to knit. Let's take another look at this stitch. Let me drop my working yarn. Okay, so here we are. This is a knit stitch. I'm going to kind of put my thumb right there so I can skewer it. When we knit into a stitch, we're always entering in through the front face of the stitch. We're always keeping the right leg on the stitch leg on the right and the left stitch leg on the left. When we purl, we're always coming into the back of the stitch. Still, we're always keeping the right stitch leg on the right, the left stitch leg on the left. So, as long as the stitch is not twisted, it can sit in either a standard or a turned stitch mount. We just need to know how to work into the stitch. I'm going to use that stitch because it's kind of stretched out and we can see it a little bit more. So, standard stitch mount. So the right stitch leg is on the front of the needle. So the face of the stitch is kind of right in here. So we're going to enter that stitch so that right stitch leg stays on the right. And there we have it. Now, if our stitch is a turned stitch mount, that right stitch leg is on the back of the needle, the left one is on the front. So we would work in to the face of the needle, just like this. Let me try purl. So if I wanted to purl into this stitch, again, this is a turned stitch mount, so I would insert my right needle into the right leg, keeping the stitch leg right, and just knit into it, or purl into it. And if we have a standard purl or a standard stitch mount, that right stitch leg is in front. Okay, so it's right here. I'm going to purl, and there we are. Now, the stitch that I've actually made are open, happy stitches. None of them are twisted. It's just all knowing, just being able to recognize where your right stitch leg is. Now, let me introduce you to new terminology. From now on, I'm going to refer to this as being an Eastern stitch. Right stitch leg in back, left stitch leg here, so the face of the stitch is here. And in my research, I've never really determined why this is called Eastern. However, in my mind, the stitch kind of faces the right, you know, and you look at a compass, the east is on the right side. I don't know. I've also heard that it's the area, the global area of origin of this kind of a knitting mount, so who knows. But anyway, this is an Eastern stitch mount. This one is a Western stitch mount. This is the industry standard, but from here on out, I will call this the Western stitch mount. Right stitch leg is in the front. The left stitch leg is in the back. I'd like for you to pause and just sit and reflect on those names and really kind of embrace those names, because that really is what the larger knitting community calls that kind of a stitch mount. So again, Eastern, and if this were sitting like this is a Western stitch mount, we work into it like this. Again, purling, we purl into our Eastern stitch mount, and Western stitch, we purl into it like that. So just sit with that information for a while. Let's take a look at this swatch. Over here we have stockinette stitch with columns of V's. The V's are the stitch legs, and at the base of each V, the stitch legs are open, happy and healthy. And over here, we have twisted stitches. And as you can see, the stitch legs at the bottom are all crossed. When I stretch twisted stitches, the stitch columns actually tighten, and all the stretch comes from the running yarn in between the stitch columns. When we stretch the normal stitches, they distribute all of the tension throughout the fabric. Twisted stitches are used for decorative purposes in some situations. And twisted stitches are achieved by knitting into the left or lagging leg of a stitch. If you're still watching this video, you rock. There's been a lot of information, especially if you're new to this terminology, this kind of knitting. And I just want to reassure you to be sure to watch Volume 3, because what we've learned, we're going to apply to real life knitting situations, like stockinette stitch in the round, garter stitch, ribbing in the round, things like that. So this will all start to fall in place. And I just want to remind you, knitting is knitting, and don't be afraid to knit different.